Hi everyone, welcome to week 13 of our class. This week we'll be talking about media and pop culture. This is one of my favorite topics this semester. We're going to dive into a lot of disability studies content this week. I hope you'll find it interesting. First and foremost, in media and pop culture studies, one concept that is really core is representation. We're going to look at a lot of different representations this week, so it's important that we understand what representation means. Representation is essentially who is being shown in a piece of media. So if we're looking at a TV show or a movie, who are the characters on screen? What are their races, ethnicities, socioeconomic statuses, disability statuses, genders, sexual orientations, and so on and so forth? Who are the people, the actors, or the characters, even in an animated kind of piece of media? We also want to be thinking about how they are shown, what they are shown doing, the kinds of activities, the kinds of personalities, the way that these characters are being portrayed. That is hugely important to representation being positive or negative. The way that the characters are being shown, the way the different identities are being shown, tells us a lot about those communities, and we learn a lot from media when we're looking at representation. We also want to look at how often certain groups are shown, particularly if we're looking at representation for race and ethnicity or for gender. We want to see, are there characters of color in this show or in this movie? Are there women? Are there gender minorities? How often are diverse representations able to be found in the media that we're consuming? And finally, we want to consider what kinds of stereotypes or tropes are potentially being used in that media. Are there discriminatory or stereotypical or problematic portrayals, or are those kinds of things being avoided or worked against? All of these questions are really important to assessing representation and understanding what type of representation, what quality of representation we are seeing in our media. To really simplify representation as much as possible, we can just create a binary here of good versus bad representation. Good representation or quality representation is going to be complex, so those characters are not going to be very simplistic or one-sided. It will also be diverse, so we'll have a lot of different kinds of representations, a lot of different identities, and it will be humanizing. So the people who are shown on screen, whether it's actors or animated characters, they are shown as full, complete, complex, interesting people and not just stereotypical or potentially problematic and harmful kinds of depictions. On the flip side, our bad representation or unfavorable or low quality representation, these are essentially just the opposites. This is going to be showing a group in ways that are very simplified, where perhaps a character is just a stereotype or a token. They're not a complex character, they're very just like surface level. There can also be, of course, a lot of different tropes, a lot of different stereotypes used in the media. We've seen this throughout history, but it still happens today where we see racist stereotypes, misogynistic stereotypes, all kinds of different problematic and oppressive types of viewpoints or jokes being used in representation. And that type of representation is really just not positive. It's not a good representation. It's not a good depiction of the community being shown on screen. Looking more specifically at the depiction of disabled people in media, disability representation is going to be a big focus of this lecture today, and it's important that we understand why good disability representation matters. First and foremost, 20% of people worldwide are disabled. That is about 1 in 5 individuals across the globe. That is a lot of people. So a lot of people are going to be impacted by disability representation. Whether they are disabled or not, watching media, watching TV shows, movies, or consuming other kinds of print media, or whatever it might be, the messages that people see about disability, whether they are themselves disabled or not, can be very hurtful or harmful, or can be a good learning experience or a positive representation. So it's very important, since we have such a large disabled community, that we have representative representation that shows the diversity and the positive traits of the community on screen or in the media. It's also important because we have this concept called the anyone, anywhere threat in disability studies. Sometimes you'll hear this called the anyone, anywhere, anytime threat as well. This is essentially the idea that any person at any place at any time can become disabled. And it's framed as a threat, or framed as something scary or to be worried about by our society, that we should all be trying to avoid disability, or we should be terrified of becoming disabled, or this idea that becoming disabled is a huge tragedy. Those kinds of beliefs are very widespread, and they are very ableist. And so when we kind of absorb those beliefs and we see this anyone, anywhere, anytime reality as a threat or a tragedy, we don't have a very positive depiction of disability. And so what the media can do is to kind of subvert that threat and show that disability doesn't have to be tragic, it doesn't have to be scary. Disability is just simply a part of life. It's something that a lot of people are born with, a lot of people acquire disabilities throughout their life. And that's actually one of the really interesting things about the disabled community and ableism as well, is that the disabled community is one of very few minority groups that pretty much every single person will join as they age. If a person is not already born with a disability, then through injuries, illnesses, or aging, every person, if they live long enough, will eventually acquire a disability. And that doesn't have to be a threat, that doesn't have to be scary, that can just be reality. That's just a part of the human condition. And so if the media gives us more of that idea, rather than the very ableist kind of fear-mongering sort of approach to representing disability, that really changes the game for people who are already disabled, but it also gives us a very different perspective to build on for individuals who acquire disabilities. Because if you think about, if you haven't gone through this experience, then acquiring a disability can be a very difficult experience. It can be a huge period of adjustment. There can be some mourning of one's previous life. And those experiences, while difficult, will be doubtlessly much easier if one has a positive idea or positive outlook on disabled life. Um, Disabled people can have really amazing, beautiful, fulfilling lives and relationships, and that kind of thing is just not really shown in the media as well or as much as would be ideal. So, in the people who are creating these representations, the development of these disability representations, we want to be thinking about what the community wants, what the community is really like, and the kinds of messages that are being created for non-disabled individuals as well. What are we teaching through the creation of these representations? Most media is created for profit-seeking reasons or for creative reasons. And so we need to question, when we create media, when we create representations, are we doing so in a just and moral and fair kind of way, especially when representing marginalized groups? In general, representation of any marginalized community, any oppressed community, or any minority group is extremely important. Having high quality representation is really impactful and can be a great learning and teaching tool for people, especially who are not a part of that community, but it also leads to inclusion and a sense of belonging for people who are a part of the community being represented. So I have a couple quotes here from some of our authors about why representation is important, particularly good representation. From Baslin 2020, I have, quote, positive representations of disability in media help form cultural imaginations toward more just communities. And the way I interpret this is that as our society absorbs more positive representation of disability and representations that are more reflective of the lived realities of disabled people, we can collectively think more about how disability can be included and valued in our society rather than devalued or something that we're afraid of. From Kearney and others in 2019, I have this quote: experiences of misrepresentation generate/exacerbate perceptions of greater social distance and inferiority, sense of identity threat, insecurity and stigma, and cognitions of social exclusion, thus negatively affecting evaluation of the self and position in the society. This is looking a little bit broader, not just at disability, but at representation in general. Um, Poor representations or misrepresentation, unfavorable representation has a lot of really harmful consequences for marginalized community. And so in avoiding those harmful consequences by creating good representations, we are buffering the well-being of our community members. And so for anybody in our course or anybody who's interested in general about creating media or being a content creator, being a director for movies or TV shows or a writer or anything along those lines, it's really important to be thinking about how to create good representation because we want these positive impacts, not these negative impacts. There are a lot of different ways that we can do representation, and unfortunately for disability representation in particular, there are a lot of historically very negative ways, and even today very negative ways that disability has been shown in the media, particularly on screen in movies and TV shows. So we're going to discuss 5 different representation types or tropes, these common patterns of representation that we see with disability. They are the, quote, super crip trope, inspiration porn, the desexualized trope, disabled villains, and incidental representation. Starting first with the super crip trope, I have a video attached here that will be posted online for you all to review on your own time. This is just the trailer for a show called Daredevil on Netflix. But across the board, super crip, the super crip trope or this kind of representation is exoticized idealization. So essentially showing disabled individuals as this just absolutely beyond inhuman level of either superpowers or being extremely good at something in a way that they are very much outside of the typical human experience or the general population. So we see a lot of examples, especially of sensory disabilities. I have down here at the bottom of this slide a picture of Toph from Avatar: The Last Airbender. This is a character who is blind, who is an earthbender. So in the show, people have the ability to move different elements of the earth in a way that is essentially like a superpower. So this character Toph is able to earthbend and also bend other elements in a way that other people are not. Like Toph is just absolutely amazing at what she does, and it's kind of attributed kind of implicitly in the show to her blindness, to her disability. And so there's this idea that, if a person's disabled as a character, especially in sci-fi and fantasy kinds of genres, that character is going to have these inhuman abilities, these amazing abilities to kind of make up for their disability, that they are unique in a way that is just beyond human comprehension. I have another example here on the screen of the character from The Good Doctor. If you've seen this show, essentially the main character is an autistic man who is just absolutely a genius, far, far more talented in his field of medicine than any of the other practitioners that he works with. And it's, again, attributed to his autism. And the example of Daredevil in the video, if you want to watch it, that is, again, another example of a blind character who's really, really good at fighting. He's kind of like a vigilante, almost like Batman type kind of character. And again, this trope, we see this over and over and over again where disabled characters have this kind of superhero, superhuman kind of ability that they're really, really amazing at something in a way that is completely unrealistic. And that's really where the problem lies with this representation, is that it's unrealistic. Not that superheroes being unrealistic is the problem, but that it creates this expectation that disabled characters are not good enough if they don't have something super unique and inhumanly impressive to bring to the table, and that disabled characters or people um, need to make up for their disability with these other kinds of skills or other kinds of abilities. Um, there are countless other examples of the supercrip trope that we could discuss, but the reading gets into it in a lot more detail, so I would urge you to really focus on that this week as you're reviewing the content. For the sake of time, I'm not going to get into too much detail as we discuss these different tropes and stereotypes. Moving on to another trope or another stereotype that we see in disability representation, inspiration porn is another huge issue in this type of representation. I have here another video that, again, you can watch on your own time that will be linked online. This is a trope, this is a video of Stella Young, a disability rights activist who unfortunately very recently passed away. She was also a comedian. She did a whole lot of different amazing things in her lifetime, and she actually is the one who coined the term inspiration porn. And this type of representation is essentially garnering sympathy rather than empathy from the audience, and doing that in the sense that disabled people are shown on screen or in the media in a way that kind of makes people feel pity or makes people feel good about themselves in comparison to the individual on screen. So we've probably all seen, different kinds of memes or inspirational posters where perhaps you'll see a person with like prosthetic legs running a marathon, and it'll say something underneath like, "What's your excuse?" Or things like, "The only disability is a bad attitude," and stuff like that. And those kinds of quotes, those kinds of media, that can be really harmful to the disabled community because it kind of paints disabled people as a prop for non-disabled people to use for their own self-esteem, or as this inspiration, this encouragement to try harder, try to be better in some way, or to feel like you are better than someone else because of their disability. To be inspired by disabled people in their lives as if they are objects, or they exist for your own motivational purposes. And that could be really problematic because disabled people don't exist to be anyone's inspiration, don't exist to be motivation for anyone. And what we tend to see happen with this kind of representation is that disabled people doing just typical day-to-day life things are reframed as doing something that's inspirational. Um, a wheelchair user might go to the gym and be lifting weights with everyone else there, but people might come up to that person and be like, "Wow, it's so amazing what you're doing," or "It's so great that you're here. It's so cool that you're able to do this." And um, those kinds of conversations, those kinds of perspectives can actually be very demeaning and very infantilizing for a lot of individuals. I have here another video as an example of inspiration porn. This is the Paralympics trailer from 2016. Again, you can find this video linked on Canvas. Sorry about all of the external links this week, but since we're looking at media and representation, it's really important that we actually consume a little bit of media to see these examples in action. So please do watch this video, and then once you have, try to reflect on who is represented in this video, which people were on screen. I think you'll find that most of the individuals represented have physical disabilities, visible disabilities. There are a lot of wheelchair users, a lot of men, and a lot of white people represented in this trailer. On the contrary, the people who are not represented would be those who I did not just list. We don't see a lot of people of color, gender minorities, or people with other kinds of disabilities represented in this video. We also want to think about what messages are shared by this video. You'll see that there's a song that goes along with this trailer, and the kinds of messages that are shared are something that a lot of people in the disabled community found to be kind of negative representation, very unfavorable representation. The song that goes along with the video has the repeating lyric, "Yes, I can," and in a sense, it kind of implies that we should, or we do, as a society, have the belief that disabled people can't do insert activity. So we're supposed to be feeling inspired. You know, we watch this Paralympics trailer, we see all of these amazing athletes who have disabilities, and we're supposed to feel inspired. We're supposed to feel proud of these people, and that, you know, it's so amazing that they can do these sports. But we don't really feel that same way about non-disabled athletes, and we don't attribute the same kinds of beliefs or perspectives to non-disabled athletes. While we might be inspired by or impressed by, you know, other kinds of Olympic athletes, it just raises a lot of questions. You know, why do we even have the Paralympics rather than including disabled athletes in the Olympics? Um, and so, while this trailer could be heartwarming to some, it could be positive representation, it could be negative representation, depending on who you ask in the context. There are a lot of moving parts here to consider. Representation is a complicated kind of beast. And so, in viewing disability representation, we want to really be thinking about what are we learning from consuming this media, and is this a good representation of the disabled community? A few other examples of inspiration porn in movies that you may be familiar with. There's this movie, Margarita with a Straw. This is a movie about a young woman who has cerebral palsy, kind of immigrating to the United States for college and exploring a new city, exploring her sexuality, and it's kind of a coming of age story. It's a pretty good movie if you're interested in watching it, but the tricky thing about this movie is that, for one, none of the actors playing disabled characters actually had disabilities. They were non-disabled actors portraying disabilities, which can be extremely problematic for a variety of reasons. Within the disability community, that's essentially considered like the disability equivalent of blackface in media, where non-disabled actors are profiting from acting as if they are disabled, when, of course, the movie producers could have hired disabled actors to play those roles instead. Um, a lot of you may also be familiar with the movie The Theory of Everything about Stephen Hawking. Again, a non-disabled actor playing a disabled character in this case. Both of these movies are supposed to be very inspirational, heartwarming stories about people overcoming adversity. And while they are, you know, rather complex representations, these are not one-sided, very simplified characters. There are some stereotypes and some problems with the representation because it is, again, aimed at that inspirational kind of approach, um, turning disabled individuals or disabled characters into objects for the inspirational purposes or the motivational purposes or entertainment purposes of a non-disabled audience. Moving on to the third trope or type of representation we are going to discuss, let's talk about desexualized representation. So this type of representation is where disabled people, particularly disabled adults, are shown as not sexual beings. So as people who are not capable of, not interested in, or who should not be having sex. And hand in hand with this type of representation, we see the infantilization of disabled people, kind of painting even disabled adults as childlike, innocent, helpless, or not complete people, not complete adults who could make their own decisions or have relationships, let alone sexual relationships. There's the stereotype that all disabled people are or should be asexual. Of course, there are asexual disabled people. That is an identity that many people will have. But the idea that all disabled people are or should be avoiding sex or not engaging in those kinds of relationships is extremely problematic and very far from reality. Disabled sex is something that's happening every single day. Disabled people, again, 20% of the worldwide population, disabled people are having relationships. They are having sexual relationships. They are having sexual encounters. They are interested in these things. There are just so many different varieties of experience in this realm that are just really being overlooked or misrepresented in the media. One of our authors calls the representation of disabled sexuality tyranny of the normal. And what this means is that our society, particularly non-disabled individuals, really don't expect to see disabled people and sexuality converge. There's this expectation that, all sex scenes in movies will include non-disabled characters, or that every love interest in a rom-com is going to be a non-disabled person. And we're really not seeing a lot of representation of disabled people having these relationships, or particularly on screen, like sex scenes in movies with disabled characters. That's just not really something that we're seeing happen very often. Um, but we see that happen all the time with non-disabled characters. That's a really huge part of so much of our media is sexual representations, sexual plots, things like that. And so, in showing disabled sex, our author Malinowska is really saying that we're subverting expectations, we're breaking norms, we are going against what people think is normal because we do have this really widespread misinformation about disabled sex and sexuality. I would urge you all to think about any examples of representations of disabled sex or sexuality that you can think of. There's probably not going to be a lot. This is something that we don't see very often. In the movie I mentioned before, Margarita with a Straw, we do see some examples of disabled sexuality. There are some sex scenes in that movie with disabled and non-disabled partners together, or disabled and disabled partners together. But again, none of the actors playing those characters actually had disabilities. You might also think about Tyrion in Game of Thrones, who is a person with dwarfism. His character is shown in a lot of sexual encounters throughout the course of that show. So we do have examples of this, but they're kind of few and far between. So definitely something very interesting about disability representation. There are not a lot of other communities that are denied this kind of representation to such an extent in comparison to the disabled community. A few other examples that you may be familiar with in somewhat more recent media, we have Quasimodo from The Hunchback of Notre Dame. In the middle of the slide here, I have a picture of Chirrut Imwe, who is a character in one of the more recent Star Wars films. At the top right, I have Walt Jr. from Breaking Bad, and again at the bottom right here, Toph from Avatar: The Last Airbender. All of these characters are examples of disabled characters who are shown as desexualized, not interested in, or sometimes even it's a joke if they are potentially interested in sexuality, relationships, or sex. Quasimodo from The Hunchback of Notre Dame is shown as kind of this unlovable, unfuckable kind of character. This idea that he's just so undesirable that he could only ever be a friend and never a love interest. And there are a lot of potentially very problematic ableist tropes in this movie. But the desexualized representation goes strong in this one. Chirrut Imwe in the center here on the slide, he is shown as this very stoic, blind, very talented fighter in the Star Wars movie. He does have a companion. It's kind of unclear if his companion or his friend is a love interest or not, or if perhaps they are a couple. Um, but there's kind of this like potentially queer sexual tension between him and this other character that's very much an undercurrent. It's not ever really addressed, and his character is very one-sided, very simple. And he is actually a great example of a very common trope for blind characters of this kind of third eye, second sight type of ability, where it's implied that he is so talented at fighting and what he does because of his blindness that he can kind of use the force better than the other characters, and he can really tap into his environment and his surroundings and feel vibrations in the ground and stuff like that in a way that makes him better able to fight than anybody else who is not blind. So he's also a really good example of the super crip trope. At the top right here, Walt Jr. from Breaking Bad. He is a teenager, so he's not an adult character, but we do see a lot of sexual representation of teenagers, especially high school students. We see a lot of kind of dramatized relationship sort of representations in the media, and all of that is totally passed by in the case of this character. He's the son of the main character in the show Breaking Bad. He's the son of Walter White. And throughout the show, the only time that his relationship status or interest in sexuality is ever mentioned is when it's a joke. It's the same case for Toph from Avatar: The Last Airbender. This character, at several points throughout the several seasons of the show, expresses interest in other characters, mentions having a crush, things like that. And every single time, it's just a joke. Most of the time, her disability is not even acknowledged whatsoever. It's kind of something that's not included in the show. It's not really a big deal. It's not really something that gets a lot of plot attention, except for when it's relevant to something to do with her super crip status or something to do with, making a joke about her disability or a joke about her sexuality. So if you think about any examples of disability representation that you're familiar with, try to think of how many examples show any kind of sexuality, any sex scenes, any sexual relationships, sometimes even romantic relationships at all between that disabled character and any other character. It's not something that we're seeing a lot of, and that is, again, very unfortunate because that does not show the reality of disabled life. Disabled people have relationships and sex lives just like everybody else. That brings us now to a discussion of disabled villains, another really common type of representation. This is one of my favorite ones to discuss. This is something that is very, very prevalent. We're all going to be very familiar with this. And this is one of our particularly damaging and very problematic types of representation. So when we think about villains in any kind of media, comic books, movies, TV shows, a lot of villains have disabilities. Some really common ones that we'll see are facial differences, what we used to call like deformities. That's not a politically correct term at this point in time, but you've probably heard that word before. We do call those facial differences today. A lot of the time we'll also see burn scars or amputations, amputated limbs, or medical technology. One good example of that would be Darth Vader and like the breathing devices and apparatuses that he uses. So these are some very common disabilities. There are, of course, others that we see villain characters have. But it's really interesting to think about, why is that happening? Why do we tend not to see the heroes in movies or TV shows have disabilities? Why do we make the villains be the ones who do? And then what kind of messages are sent by those representations when, perhaps the only time you ever see a character with burn scars is when they are evil, when they're a villain, when they're somebody scary, somebody problematic. If you're only ever seeing facial differences, again, amongst villain characters, we are not learning a very positive representation with those kinds of disabilities. And so not only does that teach us as a society that we should be afraid of perhaps people with these kinds of disabilities, but it also paints a very negative image for individuals who do have those disabilities, or especially people who acquire them. A person who acquires burn scars through, living through a house fire or something like that, if they've only ever seen people who look like them be villains and be evil characters, that's not positive representation. If you imagine the only time you ever see someone who looks like you in the media, they are a horrible, horrible person or a villain, that's going to be really, really terrible for your self-esteem, your self-image, and potentially your long-term well-being, since this is such a really common pattern. I have here again another video that I encourage you all to watch. This is going to just explore this disabled villain trope a little bit more throughout history. This is a really interesting video with a ton of different examples of this kind of representation. A few more examples that many of us may be familiar with of the disabled villain trope. I've got here on the left of the screen Captain Hook from Peter Pan. He's a good example of a character with amputations. It's pretty on the nose that his name, he is named after the hook that he has as a prosthetic for his hand, his amputated hand. I believe in some representations he also has an amputated leg, but it kind of depends on the version. But this character is obviously a very unfavorable representation of disability. He is very tokenized, very one-sided and simple. He's kind of just evil for the sake of being evil, and he's particularly creepy in the sense that he is a villain whose malice is directed at children, Peter Pan and the other young kids who are in that movie or in that story. So that's one of many examples of a disabled villain who is not a good representation of the type of disability that that person has. We also have Darth Vader, who actually kind of just like Two-Face, who is also shown here on the slide. Both of them have disabilities as essentially a punishment, as a plot point for their wrongdoing and their immorality as a person. So both Darth Vader and Two-Face are essentially burned or injured, and who acquire their disabilities after their kind of peak immorality as a character. So Darth Vader sustains a bunch of burn injuries and then becomes like the kind of iconic villain in the Star Wars world. He uses different like breathing apparatuses, and he's got visible burn scars when he's not wearing his mask and his helmet. And again, he is kind of more of a complex character, but this is not a good representation of what a person with those actual injuries would necessarily be like in real life. And that idea that disability can be a punishment for immorality is a centuries old trope, actually. This is something that goes back to the medieval era, and is the reason why a lot of people were punished or killed for their disabilities in the past, was the idea that if a person, especially if a baby was born with disabilities, that it was a punishment from God or from some deity, and that person or the parents of that baby or somebody had done something so wrong that they had to be punished with disability. While again, disability is just a normal part of the human condition, it's just a part of life. To get into that a little bit more, Two-Face is a character from Batman, from the Batman comics, but also some movies. And he, the character's, I guess, non-villain name, Harvey Dent, he is a lawyer who is in character very two-faced, a very kind of shifty sort of person, a very snaky kind of lawyer. And he is punished with disability by kind of turning him into the physical manifestation of his immorality as a two-faced person. He's burned on half of his face. And of course, the way that he appears, the way that a lot of these characters appear, is not what people look like in real life. They're kind of intentionally made scary, intentionally made visually very difficult to look at times. And that's, again, to give us this uneasiness and this feeling that this person is bad, right? Over and over and over, we're seeing this repeated motif that a person who looks like this is bad, a person who looks like this is evil. And when we kind of implicitly learn that and then go back out into the world, if we meet someone with these kinds of injuries or disabilities, or if we become someone with these injuries or disabilities, we only have this very negative, very unfavorable, very dramatic, dramatized kind of representation of these identities. Moving on to our fifth and final example of representation, I want to talk a little bit about incidental representation. This is the type of representation that simply just happens. It's not super intentional necessarily. It's not directed at any particular message. It's something that is just very matter of fact. It is not a tokenizing kind of representation. This is where a person with a disability or a character with a disability simply exists as a part of that narrative. Their disability is not really a plot point. It's not something that's really important to the story. It kind of just is. A couple examples that I have here on the slide. I have a picture of the Time magazine cover with Judy Heumann. Again, a really important disability rights activist who did unfortunately pass away very recently. Judy Heumann here, she's just shown on the magazine cover, just existing as she does as a wheelchair user. And there's not really any big deal made about it. It's not supposed to be inspirational. It's not supposed to be particularly impactful in any way related to her disability. She's simply existing, shown as herself with the mobility device that she uses. Um, and it's just a matter of fact depiction. On the right here, I have a picture of a character from a really cute kids movie that came out a couple years ago called Luca. This character, I actually don't remember his name if it was ever mentioned in the story, but he's the dad of another character in the movie. And he's a person who has an amputation. He has an upper arm amputation or above elbow amputation. And he's a good character, not super complex, but um, his disability is just very matter of fact. He's just kind of there. It's not really discussed very much. And at one point, one of the children characters does ask him what happened to his arm, and he's like, "Oh, I got bitten by a mermaid," or he makes like a joke about it, and then he's like, "Oh, I'm just kidding, I was just born like that." And again, it's just very matter of fact. It's just very normalizing disability and that kind of representation where we just see disability and it's not meant to be this big plot point. It's not meant to be something that we really even think too much about. It just is. That would be incidental representation. And this is a really positive type of representation because this is a lot like what the real world looks like. This is what reality and lived experiences for disabled people can be like, just existing, doing regular human activities out and about in the world. And it doesn't have to be a big deal. It doesn't have to be, any kind of moral tale or a learning experience. It just is. Um, so incidental representation, I would love to see more of this. There's not a lot of great examples of this. If anyone else finds or knows of any examples, I would love to hear about it because I would love some more examples to talk about in this class. Just like with most of the things we discuss in this class, it's also important that we look at the intersectional perspective when discussing media and pop culture and representation. This does not just apply to disability, this applies to all marginalized groups and all identities. We do know that marginalized groups tend to be the victims of unfavorable representation at much higher rates. Even just underrepresentation alone can be a problem where we don't see a lot of people of color or a lot of gender minorities or a lot of disabled people being shown in the media. That underrepresentation is harmful, but so is unfavorable representation. And we see a lot more unfavorable representation of marginalized groups. It's a lot less common that we're going to see, let's say, straight people, cisgender people, white people, high socioeconomic status people, people who have those kinds of dominant or privileged identities being shown in unfavorable ways. And when that does happen, it's typically not in a way that is following a decades-long pattern of unfavorable representation. It's typically not tied to oppressive stereotypes that have been used to that have been weaponized against a marginalized community. It looks very different, and the impacts are very different in those cases. Looking a little bit more at disability, though, what we tend to see in a lot of media is this kind of utopian idea, especially in science fiction and also the medical field with our very medicalized approach in the US, is focus on a world without disability or a world that doesn't really have a lot of diversity. So we can think about a lot of different kinds of utopian science fiction, sci-fi kinds of movies and TV shows where illnesses have all been eradicated. Nobody has a disability. Everyone is healthy. Everyone looks kind of the same. People live in harmony and everyone has very similar lives, and there just really isn't a lot of diversity. Um, and so, when we take an intersectional perspective as sociologists looking at this media, we want to be really critical of those kinds of representations where um, we're pushing this idea that an ideal world looks a certain way or is built for a certain kind of person, or that certain types of people would not be included in a utopian world. Some shows that do a good job with tackling this would be things like Star Trek, where diversity and disability are topics that are actually tackled by the plot pretty often. But a lot of the time we see shows like, or movies like Elysium or ideas that medical technology will come so far that we can completely eradicate illness and disability, and that's just not only completely unrealistic, but it does kind of give the idea that disabled people are not valuable, or that disabled people don't deserve the same things, or are kind of like a product of the problems in our society, rather than just, again, a part of the human condition. Disabled people don't exist just because things are wrong with the world. Disabled people exist because they always have and always will. And so when we see these, again, utopian kinds of depictions of what the world could look like without certain kinds of hardships, I really do push against that idea that a world without disability would be a utopia, because disabled people bring a lot of amazing and important things to the world, and that diversity is very valuable. So um, getting rid of diversity, getting rid of the interesting intersections of identities that we see in reality, can be very problematic. And when we do show those things in the media, it not only reflects our reality more, but it also is more inclusive and accepting, and teaches us to be more inclusive and accepting as well. There are a lot of things that we can do to create those positive representations, but a big thing is tackling the problematic things that are leading to, or those barriers that are leading to these unfavorable representations, right? We have to dismantle those isms and those phobias that are leading to the perpetuation of stereotypes and harmful kinds of perspectives, really questioning, these kinds of beliefs and these narratives that are harmful to marginalized communities. We also can be ensuring quality representation by including people who can share their voice about a topic that affects them. So if we're trying to or if we're trying to include a disabled character in the media, that we cast a disabled actor to play that part, that we cast somebody who shares the experience with the character that they're going to be playing. If we're writing about a certain experience, if we're writing about a certain community, if we have people in the writing room, or getting together, getting ready to direct a movie or TV show, that we include Black women and Latino men and disabled people, people with cerebral palsy, wheelchair users, whoever it is that we're showing on screen. It's really, really important, if the writer themselves is not a part of that community, or who doesn't have that identity, that in that room there are people to represent those stories. There are people who can speak to what those experiences are like. That can be one huge step to ensuring quality representation. That's not everything that we can do. There is so much. It's very important that we have, focus groups where we show media in progress to a community, and we ask, hey, is this good representation? How do you feel about this? Far before it hits the big screen all across the country. There's a lot that we can do to ensure that we are not perpetuating stereotypes and harm through the media that we create. Again, we want that really humanizing, that matter of fact, that non-tokenizing, beneficial, non-stereotypical, complex kind of representation for our characters of all types, not just disabled characters, but all characters, and especially those who have marginalized identities. So that was kind of a crash course run through of what media and pop culture representation can look like for disabled people, and some of the tropes and stereotypes that we tend to see in the media right now. Please do reach out if you have any questions. I think this is a really interesting topic, but those videos included in the lecture today are going to be really important to watch to kind of get the full picture of what I'm talking about here. I think you'll start to see a lot more examples of this in the media that you consume as you move forward. And please do be on the lookout for disability representation, and whether representation of other groups is positive or negative as well. This is a really important topic, and this is something that we are immersed in every single day in our society. We're always consuming media, so this is something that you can do. It's a little bit of sociology in your free time. So thank you all for being here this week, and I will see you next week.